The relic was already gone when Gideon Radu arrived. He stood in the center of the Archivist's restricted vault, his white hair catching the pale fluorescent light above, his pale hands curled at his sides with the quiet tension of a man who had not come this far to be denied. Around him, shelves of catalogued artifacts and sealed documents stretched in orderly rows, each item tagged and numbered in neat handwriting. The vault smelled of old paper, preservation chemicals, and something faintly electric, the kind of smell that meant security systems had been recently bypassed, as in, within the last hour. He turned slowly, taking in the empty glass case at the center of the room. The Valkyris medallion had rested there for 43 years, acquired through what the Budapest Metropolitan Archive called a legitimate acquisition from an estate sale, and what Gideon called an act of theft so brazen it had nearly ignited a blood war. The case was open. Its electronic lock popped cleanly from the inside, and a single white archival glove had been left on the empty velvet interior. Not a glove from a thief who had dropped it in haste. A glove placed deliberately, neatly, almost mockingly, palm upward. "You can stop pretending you just arrived," said a voice behind him. Gideon did not flinch. He turned with the unhurried grace of someone who had survived 300 years of ambushes and found the woman standing near the vault entrance, her arms crossed and her chin lifted. She was not reaching for a weapon. She was not trembling. She was watching him with dark eyes that held neither fear nor the false bravado of someone concealing fear. She was simply steady, the way a person was steady when they had already decided something and were waiting for the world to catch up. Helena Nightfall. The senior archivist who had accessed this vault with her own credentials at 11:47 in the evening, 13 minutes before Gideon's associates had deactivated the building's outer perimeter security. He had reviewed her file in the car. 29 years old, doctorate in archival science with a secondary focus on pre-modern European artifacts. Published 3 papers on ethically contested acquisitions and the blood provenance of ancient objects, a phrase that had made one of his associates laugh and made Gideon go very still. She knew what the medallion was. "I did not come here for trouble," he said, keeping his voice even. "You came here for the Valkyris medallion," she said. "So did someone else. Someone who was here before either of us, and who is currently 2 floors above us with a piece of jewelry worth more to your court than this building is worth to the city of Budapest." She tilted her head slightly. "Are we going to talk about that? Or are you going to keep looking at me like I'm the problem?" Gideon studied her for a long moment. He had lived long enough to read people the way other men read weather, and what he read in Helena Nightfall was something unusual. She was angry. Yes, but the anger was not directed at him specifically. It was the clean, purposeful anger of someone who had been outmaneuvered and did not intend to let it happen twice. "How long have you known about the medallion's true nature?" he asked. "Long enough," she said. "To have hidden a secondary tracking cipher inside the case lining 3 years ago, when I first suspected someone from your world would eventually come for it." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a slim device, a modified phone with a custom interface running a trace. "He's on the 3rd floor. He's moving toward the north stairwell." She looked up at Gideon. "He has a 15-minute head start, and I'm guessing you're faster than I am." Gideon moved. He crossed the vault in 2 steps, was past her and into the corridor before she had time to lower the device, and he moved through the archive at a speed that turned him into something between a man and a shadow, a white blur at the edge of the fluorescent lights. He went up the stairwell in near silence, passing the 2nd floor without touching the banister, arriving at the 3rd floor landing just as a figure in a dark coat shoved through the emergency exit door. The night air hit Gideon's face as he followed the figure out onto the service walkway at the back of the building, 4 floors above the alley below. The figure turned, and in the dim light Gideon recognized the face, Corvus. One of the enforcers from House Myrith, a lesser court that had spent the better part of the last century trying to acquire relics tied to the old blood laws, using them as leverage in the Council of Courts. Corvus was lean and fast and had the hollow cheeks and flat silver eyes of someone who had not fed recently enough to be careful. He held the medallion in one gloved hand, the golden disc catching the ambient light from the city below, its surface marked with the spiraling script that Gideon had memorized as a child. Prince, Korvath said, with a smile that held nothing pleasant. That belongs to House Radu, Gideon said. It belonged to the Volcris bloodline, which is extinct, Korvath said. The council ruling is under review. Possession is presently contested. Therefore, the Court of Mirith has as valid a claim as House Radu, and we exercised our right of retrieval tonight. He slipped the medallion inside his coat. Tell your father the council will be in touch. Gideon took one step forward, and Korvath dropped off the service walkway, catching a drainage pipe on the way down and landing in the alley with a sound like cracking concrete. Gideon watched him go with the cold, measured calculation of a man deciding whether pursuit was the correct choice or whether allowing the move to play out was more strategic. He was still deciding when Helena appeared beside him, having apparently taken the stairs at a pace that suggested she ran regularly, and leaned over the railing to watch Korvath disappear into the alley shadows below. He's gone, she said, slightly breathless. I can find him. And then what? Chase an enforcer from a rival court through the streets of Budapest. She straightened and looked at him with that same clear, assessing gaze. You'd be in violation of the neutrality covenant. This is a human city under an archived truce. Any overt action here negates your court's legal standing in the council claim. She paused. I looked it up. 3 years ago when I started researching the medallion. Gideon turned to look at her fully. You researched the neutrality covenant. I researched everything, she said simply, including what the Volcris medallion actually is, what it seals, and why losing it to House Mirith would be catastrophic for about 4 courts and every human city that sits above a vampire settlement. She met his gaze without blinking. So yes, Gideon Radu, I know who you are. I know what you came for, and I know you just lost it, and I think we need to talk. He was quiet for 3 full seconds, which for someone of his speed was a considerable pause. My car is out front, he said. The car was a black vehicle with tinted windows and a driver who did not speak and who had evidently been waiting since Gideon had entered the archive. Helena got in without hesitation, settled herself against the leather seat, and opened her coat to pull out a thin folder that she placed on the seat between them. The tracking cipher is still active, she said. The medallion has a secondary marker I embedded in the velvet lining of the case 3 years ago, a microscopic strip of coded material tied to a receiver signal. The cipher updates every 90 seconds. She glanced at her phone. Korvath is heading east. My guess is the Mirith safe house near the old rail district, about 4 kilometers from here. You embedded a tracking cipher in an artifact belonging to Vampire Court property, Gideon said. I embedded a tracking cipher in an artifact that was illegally removed from its country of origin decades ago and stored in my archive under false provenance documentation, she said, the precision in her voice razor-sharp. I had both the professional obligation and the ethical standing to monitor it. He looked at her for a long moment. The city lights moved through the tinted windows, painting brief patterns across her face. She was striking in the way that clarity was striking, the kind of face that held intelligence so openly it became its own form of beauty. You said earlier that losing the medallion to House Mirith would be catastrophic, he said. Explain to me what you understand about what it seals. The Volcris bloodline created the medallion as a physical anchor for a blood law they established roughly 800 years ago, Helena said, opening the folder. Inside were printed documents, handwritten notes, and photographs of the medallion from multiple angles. The blood law in question established a covenant of non-predation over 4 major human population centers in Central Europe, essentially a binding agreement between the vampire courts and the human communities above their settlements. The medallion is not a symbol, it is the actual seal of that covenant. If it is used in a blood law dissolution ceremony by a court with hostile intent, specifically if House Mirith invokes it at the next council session, the covenant technically dissolves. Gideon was silent. That means the non-predation agreement over Budapest, Prague, Vienna and Krakow becomes void, Helena continued, which I assume triggers a rather significant change in how your world operates in Central Europe. It would trigger war, Gideon said quietly, between every court that benefits from the covenant and every court that opposes it, and humans in 4 major cities would be caught in the middle. Yes, Helena said. That is what I understood. She closed the folder. Which is why I've been monitoring the medallion for 3 years, and why I called in several favors tonight to access the vault after hours, the moment my monitoring system flagged an unauthorized entry attempt. She looked at him steadily. I didn't have time to retrieve it before Korvath got there first. But the tracking cipher is still working. The car moved through the city's night streets, passing lit shop windows and late pedestrians who had no idea that in the back seat of a quiet black car, 2 people were discussing the fate of millions. Why did you do this? Gideon asked. You are human. The Blood Law Covenant technically protects you. Yes, but you had no obligation to involve yourself, no reason to spend 3 years monitoring an artifact that the courts officially consider settled. Helena looked out the window for a moment before answering. My grandmother was born in Budapest. So was my mother, so was I. She turned back to face him. The non-predation covenant is the reason this city exists the way it does. The reason my family lived their lives here without being hunted. I know most people have no idea it exists or what maintains it, but I do. I found out by accident when I was cataloging the medallion's acquisition file, and I found a discrepancy in the provenance that led me deeper and deeper until I understood what it really was. She paused. Once I knew, I couldn't unknow it, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't my problem. Gideon watched her speak. There was something in the architecture of what she had just described. The years of patient research, the quietly embedded cipher, the late-night monitoring, the willingness to walk into a vault at midnight and face a vampire prince without flinching, that struck him with the particular force of recognition. He knew what it looked like when someone operated from genuine principle rather than calculation. He had been surrounded by enough political calculation in the courts to recognize its absence immediately. The tracking signal, he said. Where is the medallion now? She checked her phone. Still east. It stopped moving about 90 seconds ago. She held up the screen so he could see the map display, a pulsing dot in the rail district. They've arrived somewhere. He leaned forward and gave his driver a new address. The safe house was a converted industrial building in the old rail district. The kind of structure that had accumulated layers of human history over a century and been quietly acquired by entities who preferred that their real estate did not appear in public records. Gideon stood in the shadow of an adjacent building across the narrow street and assessed it with the clarity of someone who had led court operations before and knew when a direct approach was a declaration rather than a retrieval. There will be at least 3 enforcers inside, he said quietly. Helena stood beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body in the cold night air, a reminder of how fragile human warmth was, how quickly it could be extinguished. Korvath would not move alone with something this valuable. Then we can't go in directly, Helena said. I could. Against 3 enforcers from a rival court while inside a human city covered by the neutrality covenant, she said. You told me yourself that overt action would negate your legal standing in the council claim. It might be worth losing the legal standing if we recover the medallion tonight, and if they destroy it in response, or invoke the dissolution ceremony immediately. She met his gaze. We need the medallion back through means that don't hand Myrith a political weapon, which means we need to think. He did not like that she was correct. He was not accustomed to being constrained by logic offered by someone else, particularly not a human someone, and the sensation was unusual in a way he was unwilling to fully examine. You said your tracking cipher gave you a continuous signal, said Isahisa. What else did you build into the lining of that case? She was quiet for a moment, then a small, careful smile appeared on her face. I also built in a chemical destabilizer, a compound that responds to a specific radio frequency and breaks down the preservation field around the velvet interior. She looked at him. Which wouldn't affect the medallion itself, it is metal, but it would make the environment inside the coat where Korvath is keeping it briefly extremely uncomfortable. Enough to make him move it. Move it where? They would have to put it somewhere else in the building. Somewhere with better containment. She tilted her head. Your court's relics have a standard containment protocol, yes? Every court does. A vault space. Usually in the lowest accessible level of whatever structure they are using. They would move it to a lower level, Gideon said slowly, away from the enforcers stationed near the entry points. Which would mean there would be a moment when the medallion is separated from most of its guards. Helena said. A brief window when someone fast and quiet, and familiar with the structure of vault containment systems, could retrieve it without technically engaging any of the enforcers in an overt act of aggression. He looked at her fully. You want me to go in through the lower level while you trigger the destabilizer from here? I want us to solve this together, she said, with a directness that was not quite challenge and not quite request, something cleanly between the two. Because I am very good at what I do, and so are you, and separately we each have what the other needs. The wind moved through the street between them, and somewhere, in the old rail district, a train passed on elevated tracks 3 blocks away, sending a low vibration through the ground. Gideon was aware of how close she was standing, of the precise and intelligent attention she directed at him, and of something he had not expected when he drove to an archive at midnight to recover an ancestral relic. He was aware of wanting to see how this particular person operated in full, to watch her do the thing she was clearly capable of doing. You will stay here, he said, out of sight. You send the frequency signal on my mark. She nodded, no argument, and pulled out the modified phone and a second small device he had not noticed before, a flat transmitter no larger than a card. He crossed the street in 3 seconds and found the building's lower access in 2 minutes. The lock was electronic and coded for House Myrith frequencies, which he had on file, because intelligence on rival courts was the kind of resource his father insisted upon, and his father was, whatever else he was, thorough. He was through the outer door and into the lower corridor in silence. The building's lower level smelled of concrete and cooling machinery and the dry, particular scent of artifact containment, chemical and faintly sweet. He moved through a corridor launched with units until he found the space that had been converted into a temporary vault, a heavy door with a biometric lock that was, in a minor irony of court politics, actually older technology than the cipher Helena had used on the archive case. He sent her the mark. 30 seconds later, on a level above him, there was a sharp exclamation in Hungarian and the sounds of rapid movement. He heard Korvath's voice issuing instructions, heard 2 sets of footsteps move towards the stairwell, and the sound of a containment box being carried. He was already behind the vault door when they arrived. What followed was not elegant. It was fast, and it was quiet, and it involved 2 enforcers being rendered unconscious through methods that Gideon was quite certain the Neutrality Covenant technically did not prohibit, because he had read the Covenant more carefully than anyone who had drafted it probably intended, and the specific language around preventing a bloodlord dissolution counted as self-defense under Article 7. He emerged from the building with the medallion in his coat and crossed back to the shadow where Helena was waiting. She saw his face and released a breath. You have it. He opened his coat slightly to let her see the golden disc, and she looked at it with an expression he'd recognized from his years, observing the very best court archivists, a mix of relief and reverence, and the deep satisfaction of someone who has successfully protected something that mattered. You're going to need to leave the city tonight, she said, the practicality in her voice not fully concealing the shift underneath it, the slight change in her breathing, the way her hands had moved together briefly before she steadied them again. The moment Myrith realizes it's gone, they'll know it was you, and if they can argue you violated the covenant, they'll take it to the council. I know, he said. Then you should go. Neither of them moved. Helena, he said, and her name in his voice had a quality he had not intended to put there, something precise and particular that had nothing to do with court strategy. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that held everything she was thinking and nothing she was uncertain about, and the city hummed around them with its 10,000 oblivious lives. The medallion needs to be formally repatriated, she said. It needs documented provenance, an official archival record of its legal return to House Radu, and a witness statement from a credentialed archivist that verifies its authenticity and chain of custody. She held his gaze. Otherwise, Myrith can claim you stole it during the contested period and you're back in exactly the same legal position. You are offering to document the repatriation, he said. I am saying it would be professionally appropriate for me to do so, she said, given that I have been the archivist of record for the medallion's holdings for 3 years, and I have the credentials to certify a provenance transfer. A pause. I am also saying that the documentation would need to be done at your court's primary archive facility, to be binding under the blood law protocols. He understood then what she was actually offering. Not just the paperwork. Not just the professional assistance. She was offering to walk into his world, the world that most humans fled if they ever glimpsed it, and do the work that would make his recovery of the medallion unassailable. She was offering to stand beside him in the place where his authority lived and make what he had done tonight irreversible. That is a significant thing to offer, he said quietly. It is a significant problem we just solved together, she said. It seems logical that we finish it together. His court was not in Budapest. House Radu's primary residence was accessible through channels that humans were not generally introduced to, which was to say it was beneath a different city entirely, connected to the surface through a series of carefully maintained transit routes that looked, to the uninitiated, like private tunnels under a particularly old and private estate outside Vienna. The estate itself was a legitimate historical property that appeared in real estate records, and paid it taxes, and employed a small staff of non-vampires who had been associated with House Radu long enough to understand discretion. They drove through the night, west and south, and somewhere in the second hour of the drive, Helena fell asleep against the car door, not dramatically, not helplessly, but with the straightforward surrender to tiredness of someone who had been running on adrenaline since before midnight and trusted, apparently, that the situation was stable enough for her body to rest. Gideon watched her sleep for longer than was necessary and thought about the strange weight of it. This human woman who had spent 3 years quietly protecting something she could have simply catalogued and forgotten, who had tracked him through his cover identities with research tools instead of supernatural ability, who had offered him documentation over weaponry and logic over fear. He thought about the way she had said, "It seems logical that we finish it together," as if the only thing that mattered was the work and the rightness of the thing being done. He had been alive for 3 centuries, and had never had a human speak to him as though his age and his power and his court title were simply the context rather than the event. He found himself not wanting the drive to end. The estate outside Vienna was called Radu Staruinsa, a name that translated roughly into English as patient endurance, which was either a piece of old-world vampire philosophy or a wry commentary on what it took to run a court for centuries, depending on who in the house you asked. Helena woke as the car turned through the iron gates, looked at the long approach through old-growth trees, and said nothing. He watched her take it in, the scale of it, the way the building seemed to emerge from darkness rather than simply stand in it, and she did not look afraid. She looked the way she had looked in the vault, alert, assessing, and already cataloguing. "How old is the building?" she asked. "The current structure dates primarily from the 17th century, he said. "The lower levels are older." "How much older?" "Considerably," he said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him. And he felt the full force of her attention, and discovered it was something he was beginning to rely on. His father was awake. Because Dragomir Radu did not sleep at convenient hours and was waiting in the lower court chamber, with the particular stillness of an ancient vampire who had decided the evening would be whatever he made of it. He was taller than Gideon, sharper in the angles of his face, with white hair pulled back formally, and eyes that were the precise silver of a blade, kept in excellent condition. He was not warm. He was something considerably more durable than warm. He looked at Helena the way he looked at anything new that arrived in his court, with complete and unhurried analysis. "Father," Gideon said, "this is Helena Nightfall, senior archivist at the Budapest Metropolitan Archive. She has agreed to certify the medallion's repatriation provenance." "Has she?" Dragomir said, not looking away from Helena. "I have," Helena said, and met the ancient vampire's gaze with the same steadiness she had offered his son. "I have 3 years of monitoring documentation, an embedded tracking record, and professional credentials recognized under both the Budapest Convention and the 1987 Radu-Myrath Neutrality Protocols, which I note your court actually drafted." A brief pause. "The documentation I provide will be legally unimpeachable at the council level." Dragomir was silent for a moment. Then he looked at his son. "She knows the 1987 protocols," he said. "She researched everything," Gideon said. Something shifted in the elder vampire's extradition almost imperceptibly in the direction of something that might, in a being less ancient and less restrained, have been approval. "The archive room is prepared," Dragomir said, and left them to it. The archive room in the lower court was nothing like the archive where Helena worked. It was lit by both fluorescent panels, installed in a gesture toward modernity, and older light sources she could not immediately identify. A warm amber glow that came from recessed fixtures of a design she did not recognize. The shelves were stone and iron, not metal and particle board, and the documents stored in them were preserved through methods that clearly predated modern archival science. The room smelled of very old paper and metal, and something faintly mineral, like stone that had been in darkness for a very long time. Helena worked with the focused calm of someone in their element. She had brought her own kit from the archive, a professional habit that meant she carried field documentation supplies when she came to work after hours, and she spread her materials on a stone table and began constructing the provenance record with the same precision she brought to everything. Gideon watched her work, leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, and was struck repeatedly by the efficiency of her, the lack of wasted motion, the way she built a document, the way a very good architect built a structure, with clear logic and clean lines. "You will need to provide a formal statement of lineage for the medallion's original acquisition by House Radu," she said without looking up. "Pre-Valkyris dissolution. The statement needs to establish that the bloodline formally bequeathed the relic to your court before extinction." "That document exists," he said. "It is in this room. Third shelf, iron box, marked in Valkyris script." She looked up. "You have a pre-extinction bequest document from the Valkyris bloodline." "My court has maintained it for 4 centuries, he said. She set down her pen. "Then why has your claim with the council been contested?" "Because House Myrith argued the document was of disputed authenticity when we submitted it to the council's review body 6 years ago, and the review has been deliberately delayed through procedural challenges while Myrith positioned itself to physically acquire the medallion and make the legal argument moot," he said. "It is the kind of court politics that looks mundane until you realize that the practical consequence is the potential dissolution of a centuries-old protection for millions of people." She absorbed this. So the document is real, but Myrith contested its authenticity to stall the legal process. "Yes. Then what I need to do," she said slowly, "is construct a provenance record that incorporates the Valkyris document, my 3 years of monitoring records, the tracking data from tonight, and a formal archival certification of the document's authenticity under modern forensic archival standards." She looked at the iron box on the third shelf. "If I can certify the Valkyris document using methods the council's review body cannot dismiss, the entire basis for Myrith's challenge collapses." Gideon pushed off the wall and crossed to the third shelf. He retrieved the iron box and carried it to the stone table, setting it before her. "That document has not been independently authenticated in its modern archival sense," he said. "Court documents of that age have been examined by court archivists within vampire academic traditions, but never through human forensic analysis." She opened the box with careful hands and lifted the document inside. It was on a material she could not immediately identify, not paper, not parchment, something between the two, with a surface that had an unusual resilience. The script was dense and flowing, in a language she did not read, and there were 2 seals pressed into the material itself, one bearing a mark she recognized from her research as the Valkyris emblem, and one bearing the emblem of House Radu. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. "It is evidence," he said. "Or it would be, if it could be presented in a form the council's modern review procedures accept." "I can authenticate it," she said. "I have the field equipment for material analysis and script verification. It will take a few hours, but I can run a full forensic archival certification tonight." She looked up at him. "If the material composition is consistent with the documented age and the script matches the known Valkyris corpus from your archive's other holdings, I can sign a certification that would hold up in any academic review, and if it holds up in academic review, it holds up in the council." He looked at her, this human woman in his family's ancient archive, holding a document that had been waiting 4 centuries for exactly this kind of help. "You would do this," he said. "I'm doing it," she said, and reached for her field kit. It was 3 in the morning, and then it was 4. And somewhere in the 5th hour she pushed back from the table and stretched her neck and said without ceremony, "The material composition dates the document to between 700 and 800 years ago, consistent with the Valkyries active period. The script matches 11 other documents in your archive's Valkyries collection. The seals show no evidence of forgery or later addition. This document is exactly what you say it is." Gideon said nothing for a moment. The amber light fell across the table, across the document and her equipment, and her hands that had spent hours on this with no one watching. "Helena," he said. She looked up. "What you have done tonight," he said, choosing his words with the care he applied to very few things, "is not something I will forget." She held his gaze, and in the quiet of the archive room something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with theatrics, but with the particular finality of a shift that both people feel at the same moment, and both people know they feel. "I should finish the certification document," she said. "Yes," he said, and did not move from where he was standing. They worked until dawn in the way of two people who have discovered that their working rhythms are complementary, that the silence between them is easy rather than empty, that the occasional question or observation that one offers the other is received without defensiveness or a hierarchy. Gideon located documents on request with the efficiency of someone who knew every item in the room by memory. Helena organized them with the systematic thoroughness of someone who believed that how you keep records is itself a form of respect for what the records mean. The completed provenance package was the most comprehensive document in the room's 5 centuries of use, and they both knew it. When the first grey of dawn began to register even in the sealed lower court, Gideon said, "You should sleep. There are rooms upstairs that receive no direct sunlight." She looked at him sideways. "Is that a vampire precaution or a courtesy to me?" "It is both," he said. "The estate is built to accommodate inhabitants who prefer their schedules to remain flexible in regard to daylight." She smiled, briefly and genuine, and with the slight weariness of someone who had been awake for 20-odd hours, and it caught him completely off guard because it was not the composed, assessing expression she had worn all night. It was simply her, tired and satisfied and present. "I appreciate that," she said. He did not sleep. He did not need to. Not urgently, and he spent the daylight hours doing 2 things. The first was drafting the formal submission to the Council of Courts, incorporating Helena's certification as its evidentiary centerpiece, and requesting an emergency session on grounds of neutrality covenant threat, a provision that required a response within 7 days. The second was thinking, with more focus than the situation strictly demanded, about a woman asleep in one of his family's rooms upstairs. He thought about the first time he had seen her in the vault, not afraid, with that white archival glove in the empty case and 3 years of preparation behind her. He thought about the particular flavor of her intelligence, the way she moved through problems, the way she had said it seemed logical that we finish it together, as if that were simply obvious. He thought about the document on the stone table and what it had meant to have someone confirm with precision and care that the thing he had been trying to prove for 6 years was real. He thought about what it meant that she felt like someone he had been waiting to encounter and had not known he was waiting. The council's emergency session was called within 4 days of the submission. It convened in the fashion that council sessions had convened for centuries, in the deep court chamber beneath the oldest surviving structure in the system of interconnected settlements under Vienna, a room that predated the city above it by several hundred years and had walls that had heard more decisions affecting the shape of human history than any parliament or legislature above ground. Gideon had been in this room before. He had presented before the council at 23 as a young prince observing his father at 41 when he argued his first contested boundary claim, and 6 years ago when he submitted the Valkyries bequest document and watched the review body accept it provisionally, and then watched Myrith begin the slow procedural dismantlement of that acceptance. He stood before the assembled courts now with Helena beside him, and it was the beside him that mattered. She had dressed for it, not in court fashion. She could not have known court fashion, but in something professional and precise and entirely herself, a dark suit with clean lines that said expert rather than ornament. and she carried her certification portfolio under one arm with the composure of someone who was in the right place. The representative of House Myrith across the chamber was a vampire named Severaxa, older than Korvath, and considerably more controlled, with the kind of face that gave nothing away and eyes that assessed the room constantly. She looked at Helena with a particular attention that Gideon did not like. "The submission before the council," said the chamber arbiter, an ancient entity of indeterminate age who served all courts without allegiance, "includes a forensic provenance certification issued by a human archival expert." A pause waited with centuries of court procedure. "The council will hear the basis for accepting such a certification as admissible evidence." Helena stepped forward before Gideon could. "The certification is issued under the Budapest Metropolitan Convention for Archival Authentication," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber, "which is itself incorporated by reference into the 1987 Radu-Myrith Neutrality Protocols under Appendix 3, subsection 4, as the governing standard for human-managed archives holding vampire court property." She opened the portfolio and placed a copy of Appendix 3, subsection 4, on the presentation surface. "Your own protocols designated my professional standards as the applicable certification framework. I applied those standards to the Valkyris bequest document and found it authentic. Unless the Council intends to repudiate the protocols it drafted, the certification is admissible." Silence in the stone chamber, Severaxa said. "With careful precision, the human archivist's argument assumes the protocols remain in force." "The protocols are not contested," said the chamber arbiter. "They are registered as active instruments." "Then," Severaxa said, shifting, "we contest the chain of custody of the medallion itself. It was removed from a human archive under circumstances that may have violated the neutrality covenant." "The medallion was removed from the Budapest Metropolitan Archive by an agent of House Myrith," Helena said, before anyone else could respond, and she drew the tracking data log from her portfolio, a printed record of the cipher's activity for the past 3 years, annotated in her handwriting. "This tracking record, generated by a monitoring instrument I installed with my professional authority as Archivist of Record for the relevant collection, shows the medallion's location from its initial acquisition to the present. It shows an unauthorized extraction by a Myrith-associated agent on the date in question, followed by transport to an address in Budapest's rail district. It shows a subsequent recovery by a representative of House Radu." She set the log on the presentation surface beside Appendix 3. "House Myrith's agent acted in violation of both the neutrality covenant and the contested status of the claim by physically removing the medallion from neutral human custody. House Radu's recovery of the medallion was a response to that violation, not a prior act." The chamber arbiter examined both documents. The stone chamber held its silence. Gideon stood 2 steps behind Helena and watched her, and felt something he could not have described to anyone in the room. Something that was not quite pride because she was not his to be proud of, and was not quite awe because she was standing right next to him, and entirely real, but was something made of both of those things, plus the specific warmth of witnessing someone be exactly as extraordinary as you already knew they were. Severaxa attempted 2 more procedural challenges. Helena answered both with documentary evidence and exact protocol citations that she produced from her portfolio in the unhurried sequence of someone who had anticipated them. The council deliberated for 6 minutes, which was historically brief. The ruling was formal and final. The Valkyris bequest document was authenticated. The medallion's legal ownership was confirmed as House Radu. The non-predation covenant over the 4 cities was ratified and strengthened, its dissolution mechanism removed in recognition of the extinction of its originating bloodline. House Myrith received a formal censure for violation of neutral custody protocols and a restriction on operational presence in the designated cities for a period of 20 years. The chamber emptied in the way of vampire courts. Quickly and without sentiment, courts returning to their various politics and the arbiter retreating to their eternal patience. Gideon and Helena were left in the stone chamber with the sound of the last footsteps fading. She let out a slow, controlled breath, and he recognized it as the release of something that had been held carefully for a very long time. "It's done," she said. "It is done," he said. She turned to look at him, and the precise Professional composure softened slightly at the edges, not into distress or collapse, but into something quieter and more open. She looked like herself, he thought, without the full weight of the problem on top of it. "What happens now?" she said. "The medallion will be formally secured in the court archive," he said. "The covenant documentation will be updated and distributed to all participating courts. Myrith will protest the censure through various channels for several years before accepting it." He paused. "And I will send a formal communication to the Budapest Metropolitan Archive acknowledging the professional service provided by its senior archivists and recommending that said archivists' access to court-related archival materials be expanded under the new cooperative framework we will be establishing." He held her gaze. "It is the least I can do." She looked at him for a moment with that clear, steady attention. "That is a very formal way to say that you want to keep working with me." "It is," he agreed, "a very formal way to say that." The space between them was small, and the amber light was the same as it had been in the archive room, and he was aware with the lot of his attention that she was looking at him not as a subject of study or a political ally or a supernatural entity to be managed, but as a person she had been standing very close to for 4 days and nights, and had formed, through shared danger and shared work, and the shared knowledge of having done something that genuinely mattered, a particular and irreversible feeling about. "Gideon," she said. He took one step, and she did not step back, and he said her name in return, her full name Helena, the way he had learned to say it as if it were its own kind of document. Precise and carefully kept. She kissed him first, because she was Helena Nightfall, and she did not wait for the correct moment to arrive when she could construct it herself, and it was not a tentative thing. It was the kind of kiss that arrives after 4 days of two people discovering each other through work and danger, and the particular intimacy of sitting in a room at 4 in the morning with something that matters and making it right together. He held her with the careful certainty of someone who had been 3 centuries in the world and knew the difference between fragility and strength, and she was neither fragile nor trying to be strong for show. She was simply warm and steady and absolutely present, and it was so unexpected and so exactly right that it was several moments before either of them moved apart. "The cooperative framework," she said against his shoulder, and he felt her smile against the fabric of his coat, "is now considerably more personal," he said, and held her in the weeks that followed. Helena returned to the Budapest Metropolitan Archive and filed the most remarkable professional report of her career, a full account of the provenance research, the tracking system, the certification, and the council ruling, written with impeccable academic precision, and completely silent on the personal elements that were no one's business but her own. The report was peer-reviewed, published in the European Journal of Archival Science, and cited 12 times in its first year, including once by the Council of Courts in their revised framework for human archive management of contested vampire court property. She also answered Gideon's communications, every one of them, sometimes with professional content, and increasingly with the kind of conversation that had no professional content at all. She learned that he was a devoted student of 4 centuries of human music and had opinions about composers that were highly specific and occasionally ambivalent. She learned that the formality of his court-bearing was real and genuinely his, not a performance, but that it existed alongside a private humor that was dry and very old and occasionally perfectly devastating. She learned that he had been in the council chamber when the first non-predation covenant was struck, as a young vampire, barely a century old, standing beside his father, and had understood even then what was being protected and had cared about it, in a way the political structures of his world did not always make room for. He learned that she ran 5 kilometers every morning, regardless of the weather, because she found it clarifying. He learned that she had grown up in a small flat with her mother and grandmother, and had spent her entire childhood in libraries because her grandmother had told her that books were the best company, and she had never found sufficient reason to disagree. He learned that she was fluent in 4 languages and functional in 3 others, and that she had known, from the first catalogue entry that had revealed the medallion's true nature, that she was going to protect it or exhaust herself trying, and that this decision had not frightened her because some things were simply worth the full measure of what you had. He came to Vienna often on court business, which had always been true, and he began arriving a day earlier than necessary to drive to Budapest first. And Helena began arranging her schedule with a flexibility she had not bothered with before, and found that the flexible days tended to coincide with when a particular black car with tinted windows appeared at the archive entrance. 3 months after the council ruling, Dragomir Radu summoned his son to a formal meeting and said, with the economy of a man who had been ancient long enough to find directness efficient, the Archivist. "Her name is Helena Nightfall," Gideon said. "I know her name," his father said. "I have read her published report 3 times. She is exceptional." A pause. "What are your intentions?" Gideon looked at his father with the patience of a man who had known this conversation was coming. "My intentions are my own," he said, "and hers." Dragomir was quiet for a moment in the way of ancient vampires, which was a quality of silence that had been accumulating weight for centuries and could not be compared to the silence of shorter-lived beings. "She is human," he said, not as an objection, but as the statement of a fact that carried consequences. "I am aware," Gideon said. "The lifespan question is not trivial," his father said. "I do not raise it to obstruct you. I raise it because you are my son, and I have watched enough centuries pass to understand what it costs." "I know what it costs," Gideon said, "and I know that the alternative, which is to withdraw from something real because of what might eventually happen, is a worse kind of loss." Dragomir looked at his son for a long moment with those ancient silver eyes. "She would need to be formally presented to the court," he said at last. "As your chosen consort, under the old forms." "I know the old forms," Gideon said. "Does she?" "She will," Gideon said with a quiet certainty, "research everything she did." He told her in the way he told her things, directly and with full information and without softening the parts that were complicated, that there was a formal court presentation involved if she wanted to occupy the place in his life that he was offering her, that it was not a small commitment, that it would bring her into formal contact with the courts and their politics in ways that could not be undone, and that the life he was describing was not safe in the way that ordinary lives were safe, though he would protect her with everything he was and everything he had. He told her all of this, sitting across from her at a small table in the cafe she had taken to meeting him at in Budapest, with coffee in front of both of them. Hers warm and his ordered out of courtesy. She listened to all of it. She asked 3 precise questions about the legal standing of a human consort under blood law protocols, the degree to which court protection would extend to her family, and whether the covenant she had helped protect would remain stable under the new framework. He answered all 3. She drank her coffee. "You understand," she said, "that I am not going to be rearranged by this. I am going to remain exactly who I am, working on what I work on, making the decisions I decide to make. I would not have it any other way," he said, and meant it with the full weight of 3 centuries of knowing exactly what he valued. "And the lifespan question," she said, with the steady look she gave to everything that mattered. "We are not going to pretend it does not exist." "No," he said, "we are not. There are options," she said, and he saw that she had researched this too, quietly, on her own, because she was Helena Nightfall, and she did not walk into situations she had not examined from every angle. "The blood bond, the ritual transition, I know they exist. I have read enough to understand broadly what they involve." She met his gaze. "I am not dismissing them. I am also not rushing toward them. I want to live the life we are choosing before I make a decision about how long I live it." "Yes," he said. "Then we are in agreement," she said, and reached across the small table and took his hand, which was pale and cool, and had, in her experience, held a recovered relic in a nighttime rail district, and located a pre-extinction bequest document on a stone shelf in the dark, and turned the pages of a very old treaty with the attention of someone who had never stopped caring what was written in it. "We are in agreement," he said. The formal court presentation was held 6 weeks later, in the deep court chamber that had last witnessed genuine ceremony 40 years prior, when the last major treaty between the Eastern courts had been ratified. Gideon stood at the center of the chamber, and Helena stood beside him in something she had decided on herself, a deep burgundy that was not trying to be a court color but happened to be one anyway. And she faced the assembled courts with the composure of someone who had already stood in this room and been rather more outnumbered and had still been fine, Dragomir conducted the presentation. He was formal in the way that he was always formal, which was completely, and he spoke the old words, with the precision of someone who had heard them spoken over many centuries and knew their weight. He presented Helena Nightfall as consort to Prince Gideon Radu of House Radu, under the old forms, with the court's recognition and the house's protection, and the assembled courts witnessed it in the various ways of their various natures. When it was done, when the old words had been spoken and the witnessing completed, Gideon turned to Helena and took her hands, and she looked up at him with the dark eyes that still held everything she was thinking, and nothing she was uncertain about, and he was struck, again, as he had been in the vault and the archive room and the council chamber and the small café, by the precise and irreplaceable quality of her. "You did research everything," he said quietly. "I always do," she said. "Is this what you expected?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely, in the way she genuinely thought about things. "The chamber is larger than I imagined," she said. "Your father is exactly as I imagined. And you are." She paused, and for just a moment the composure shifted into something purely warm. "Considerably better than I expected, which is saying something. Because I expected a great deal." He brought her hands to his lips, which was an old-world gesture that he had not made in some time and had not expected to make again, and she did not find it archaic. She found it what it was, which was him. This particular man who was also a vampire prince and who had spent 3 centuries waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone who would research the blood law protocols and show up in a midnight vault without fear, and offer him not just a relic, but everything that came after it. In the years that followed, the cooperative archival framework Helena had helped establish became one of the more significant administrative achievements in the history of human-vampire institutional relations, a phrase that appeared exactly like that in the Council's revised historical records, and sounded, to everyone who read it, considerably less remarkable than it actually was. She expanded the framework herself, drafting guidelines for 23 archives across Central Europe and training a generation of archivists in the careful, patient work of managing materials that belonged to worlds most people would never see. She published a second paper, and a third, and began a book that would take her 4 years to complete, and that she dedicated, in the acknowledgements, to the long-term stability of the non-predation covenant, and to the patience of old stone archives, and to the particular quality of amber light in rooms that have been keeping things safe for a very long time. She turned 35, and 37, and in her 40th year she told Gideon. In their apartment above the Budapest archive where they had been living since the year, she formally accepted the position of senior archivist for vampire court holdings in Central Europe, that she had made her decision about the lifespan question. He sat very still. She had chosen to accept the blood bond, which was neither the casual arrangement its name might suggest, nor a surgical procedure, nor anything that could be compared to ordinary human medicine, but was an ancient commitment within vampire tradition that extended the life of the bonded individual significantly, without the full transformation of ritual transition, preserving the essential humanity of the person while altering their biology enough to make time a less urgent constraint. It was not immortality. It was not without risk. She had spent 2 years researching it before she said the word aloud. "You're certain," he said. "I have read every document in your family archive on the subject," she said. "I have spoken at length with your father, who was considerably more forthcoming on this topic than I expected. I have reviewed the medical documentation of every bonded individual in living court memory." She met his gaze with the specific look that had never changed, clear and steady, and already arrived at its destination. "I am certain, Helena," he said, with the particular weight he always put in her name. "I want to do the work," she said. "The archive framework, the documentation, the research, the things we are building together. I want to do it with the amount of time it actually deserves." She paused. "And I want to do it with you, for an amount of time that is worthy of what this is." He crossed the room and held her face in both his hands, his cool, pale fingers against her warm skin, and she leaned into his hands the way she had leaned into everything about him from the beginning, not because she was looking for something to hold her up, but because she had decided he was where she wanted to be. "What this is," he said quietly, "has been the great unexpected fact of my life." "Good," she said. "You needed one." He laughed, actually laughed, which was a sound that the stone walls of the old vampire courts had not heard from him in longer than Helena had been alive. And she watched his face when he laughed and thought, as she had thought many times in different forms, that this was the thing she had been doing all those years of careful work without knowing it, building something precise enough and strong enough and real enough to hold a love like this. The blood bond ceremony was private, witnessed only by Dragomir and 2 court elders, who served as the required formal witnesses under the old protocols. Gideon administered it in the way of the old forms, with the language of ancient vows that predated every institution Helena had ever studied, and she received it with her eyes open and her hands steady, and her heartbeat the clear and deliberate rhythm of someone who was choosing exactly where they stood. When it was done, she did not feel dramatically different. She felt like herself, which she had been told to expect, and she felt the change in the way of something that happens at the cellular level and makes itself known slowly, over days and weeks and the quiet accumulation of a life. And she felt Gideon's hand in hers, which was what she had felt from the first time she took it across a small cafe table, and which remained the most precise and specific of all the things she was certain about. They walked out of the ceremony chamber and up through the estate and out into the night, which was clear and cool and full of the particular quality of Vienna in autumn. And Helena stood in the garden of Radu Strowincenza and looked up at the sky and thought about 3 years of watching an artifact in a case, and a glove placed deliberately in an empty velvet interior, and a man who arrived at midnight expecting to find a relic and left with something considerably more difficult to quantify and considerably more worth the journey. "The garden needs work," she said. "It has needed work for approximately 60 years, he said. "I have thoughts," she said. "Of course you do," he said. "You researched it." "I love you," she said, into the night, without preamble or qualification, the way she did most things, with clarity and complete intent. "I love you," he said, and it was 3 words carrying 3 centuries of waiting and the specific weight of being found, finally, by someone who had tracked him down through research and principle, and the patient, iron-willed certainty that some things were worth the full measure of what you had offered him not just documentation, and not just her expertise, and not just her courage, but herself, entirely and without reservation, in the middle of everything that was dangerous and worth protecting. The stars above Vienna were the same stars that had been above the court for 500 years, and below them the city hummed with its 10,000 oblivious lives, held safe by a covenant recorded in an archive, certified by a woman who had understood that the work of keeping things intact was not lesser than the work of building new things, but was itself a kind of creation, patient and precise and permanent. They went inside together, out of the autumn night, and the garden waited for them with all the time it had always had, and for the first time in a very long while, so did they.